On a lonely Kansas road, a black horse lay dying, skin and bone, forgotten by everyone who passed. No one slowed, no one cared, until Daniel Cooper, a farmer drowning in his own grief, stopped his truck. That moment of hesitation would ignite a story of survival, defiance, and redemption, where compassion challenged cruelty, and a broken horse gave a broken man a reason to live again. The road stretched across the flat lands of Kansas, a ribbon of red dust shimmering under the late summer heat. Grass had turned brittle, whispering against the wind like dry paper. Along that lonely stretch, where trucks sometimes rumbled past carrying grain or hay, something darker lay slumped in the ditch. At first glance, it looked like a pile of burned logs, or maybe an abandoned tarp. Only when the breeze lifted did the truth reveal itself. It was a horse. The animal's coat had once been black, perhaps shining like coal under the sun. Now it was dulled to the color of ashes, ribs pushing out sharply beneath the skin. Its mane hung in tangled ropes, dust coating every strand. One eye, clouded and tired, blinked slowly, as if fighting the weight of gravity itself. The sound that escaped its throat was not a whinny, but a rasp, a broken wheeze that belonged to something on the edge of life. Cars passed without slowing. Farmers heading home from the fields glanced once, then looked away. A boy in the passenger seat of a pickup asked his father why the horse was lying there. "It's finished," the man said flatly, eyes fixed on the road. "Not worth stopping for." The truck rolled on, leaving only a swirl of dust behind. Even the birds seemed to sense the end. A crow perched on a fence post nearby, wings lifting in the heat, waiting for stillness to claim the creature. The world had already judged this horse. It was nothing now, a shadow of work long spent. But the horse, somehow, had not yet given up. Its ears twitched faintly at every sound, as if listening for a mercy that never came. Its hooves scraped weakly at the dirt, then stilled. It lay there in the ditch like a discarded piece of history, forgotten by everyone who passed. The sky was beginning to soften into the colors of evening, muted orange, pale gold, the long shadows of cottonwoods stretching across the road. Light struck the horse's body in slanted lines, marking each rib like the bars of a cage. The air smelled of hot earth, gasoline from the trucks, and the faint tang of sage carried by the wind. All of it mixed into the kind of loneliness only the wide plains could hold. Then, from a distance, the slow groan of an engine broke the silence. A battered blue Ford pickup came into view, paint faded, one headlight cracked. It rattled along the dirt road with a weariness that matched the man behind the wheel. Daniel Cooper sat hunched over, hat pulled low against the glare. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the calloused certainty of someone who had worked the land too long to expect any favors from it. 42 years old, he looked older still, face lined by sun and grief, shoulders stooped not from age but from the weight of silence. The radio was broken, so the only sound inside the cab was the rattle of loose bolts and the low sigh of the wind through the cracked window. He wasn't heading anywhere special, just back to his farm on the outskirts of Wichita. It had been another long day harvesting corn, the kind of work that filled the hours, but never the hollow space left inside him. Since the accident, the one no one in town spoke of directly, Daniel had lived in a rhythm of chores and silence. Wake up, work, Eat little, sleep less. Repeat. As the truck neared the ditch, he saw the shape. At first, he thought it was debris. Then the head lifted slightly, and his hands tightened on the wheel. He slowed. Dust curled up behind the tires as the truck came to a stop. For a long moment, Daniel didn't move. He just sat there, staring through the windshield at the broken creature on the roadside. Something inside him shifted. A flicker he didn't want to name. It had been years since he'd let himself feel much of anything at all. The horse lifted its head again, just barely, and its eyes met his. Clouded though they were, there was a spark in them. Weak, but unmistakably alive. Daniel swallowed hard, the steering wheel suddenly feeling like iron beneath his palms. The voice in his head told him what every other driver had already decided. Keep going. It's not your problem. It's not your burden. But Daniel didn't turn the key. The engine idled, coughing softly as if waiting on his decision. He rubbed a thumb over the crack in the steering wheel, staring at the ditch. The air in the cab grew heavy. He remembered another set of eyes, blue and wide, looking at him the same way once, pleading for help he couldn't give. The memory sliced through him, raw and uninvited. His breath caught. He reached down, turned off the ignition, and sat in silence as the engine died. Dust settled back to the ground. The world grew quiet again, except for the faint, desperate sound of the horse breathing. Daniel opened the door and stepped out. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked slowly toward the ditch. The horse flinched at the sound but didn't try to rise. It had no strength left. The smell hit him first, sweat dried on skin, dust, the sour tang of neglect. He crouched, resting one knee on the brittle grass. Up close, the horse's scars were clearer, long healed welts across its back, patches of missing hair, the dull sheen of exhaustion. Daniel exhaled through his nose, fighting the urge to step back. His hand hovered in the air, uncertain, then lowered slowly. Fingers brushed the tangled mane, coarse and greasy with dirt. The horse twitched under his touch, but didn't pull away. Daniel swallowed. The sky above him dimmed as the sun slid further west. He thought about climbing back into his truck, driving home, forgetting this moment. But the horse's eyes caught his again. Clouded, yes, but not empty. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something stir deep inside. The question he had buried for so long. Will you leave me too? He sat there in the fading light, his hand on the broken animal's neck, caught between the life he had resigned himself to and the life this dying horse seemed to demand of him. And though no words were spoken, the silence felt like an answer. Daniel stayed crouched by the ditch longer than he meant to, the heat of the day giving way to the cool breath of evening. The horse's labored breathing matched the slow beat of his own heart, both of them worn down by burdens too heavy to carry alone. When he finally rose to his feet, dust clung to his jeans, and his knees ached in protest. He wiped his palms on the fabric as if to rub off the weight of the decision forming inside him. His pickup waited with the door hanging open, cab filling with the smell of sage. But he didn't climb in. Instead, Daniel circled back to the bed of the truck, unlatched the gate, and stared at the empty space inside. He had hauled plenty of things in this truck: bales of hay, sacks of feed, even fence posts splintered from storms, but never something that looked so close to death. He rubbed the back of his neck, unsure whether he was preparing for salvation or foolishness. The horse shifted, as if sensing his hesitation. Its hooves dragged lightly against the dirt, a feeble attempt to move. The sight cut through Daniel. He fetched the rope he kept coiled under the seat, the same one he used for repairs, and walked back down the ditch. "Easy now," he murmured, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken softly to anything in years. It took time, patience, and more strength than he expected to coax the horse toward the truck. Twice it stumbled, nearly collapsing, and Daniel braced his shoulder under its gaunt neck to keep it steady. Sweat dampened his shirt, the strain burning his muscles. By the time he guided the animal up the ramp, he fashioned from 2 old planks. His chest heaved like he'd plowed an entire field by hand. When the horse finally lay down in the truck bed, exhausted, Daniel tied the rope loosely, not as a restraint, but as a promise. "You're not being left behind again." He slammed the gate shut, climbed back behind the wheel, and started the engine. The pickup shuddered to life, headlights cutting across the darkening fields. The road home stretched before him in a ribbon of gold dust, and every mile carried a weight he hadn't felt in years, not since the day his son was taken from him. The memory struck without warning, as sharp as barbed wire. He saw the boy's small hands clutching the toy tractor, the sound of laughter swallowed by the roar of the machine. He had replayed that moment 1,000 times, each time ending the same. Silence, sirens, the town whispering behind their hands. He had lost not just his child, but his faith in being needed by anyone, even himself. But now, in the rattling truck, something unexpected pressed against his silence, the faint, rhythmic sound of the horse breathing in the back. It wasn't steady, but it was there. Each breath, however fragile, whispered of stubbornness, of clinging to life. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter. He was driving not only toward his farm, but toward a choice he hadn't meant to make. To try again, even when trying had cost him everything before. The farm appeared on the horizon as twilight deepened, its outline as familiar as the lines of his own hands. Faded red barns slumped against the land, a windmill creaked lazily, and fields stretched wide but tired, their crops thinned by the harsh summer. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. He pulled up near the smaller outbuilding, the one that had once been a stable. The boards sagged, roof patched with tin, but it smelled faintly of hay and soil. He remembered how his son had loved to sneak inside, pretending the old stallions of storybooks might appear there. Daniel forced the thought away as he climbed out. It took nearly half an hour to coax the horse down from the truck. The creature trembled at every movement, legs unsteady as reeds in the wind. Daniel spoke little, only low murmurs. Steady. One more step. At last, the horse collapsed into the straw he had spread earlier, sides heaving but eyes still open. Daniel stepped back, chest rising and falling as he watched the animal settle. He draped his old jacket over its back, olive green, faded from years of sun. It had been his son's favorite to wear when he followed him into the fields. Now it served another purpose, thin armor against the chill creeping into the night. He sat on the threshold of the stable, elbows on his knees, staring into the darkness where the horse lay. Crickets sang in the fields, and the sky stretched wide with stars. He felt the ache in his bones, the heaviness of exhaustion. But beneath it all, a strange hum lingered, something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. responsibility. The farm had long been a place of silence, haunted by memory. But tonight, as Daniel leaned against the wooden frame, listening to the slow, uneven rhythm of another living being nearby, it felt different. Not healed, not yet, but less empty. For the first time in years, he didn't dread tomorrow. The night passed slowly. Daniel had dozed off against the wooden frame of the stable, his hat tilted low over his face, though true sleep never came. He woke often at the sound of the horse shifting, or when the night air pressed too sharply through the thin fabric of his shirt. By dawn, the Kansas sky glowed pale gold, and the breath of the plains stirred cool and sweet against the fields. Inside the stable, the horse had not moved much. Its sides still rose and fell in shallow waves, each one fragile, as if borrowed from something beyond its strength. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, every bone stiff from sleeping on wood, and fetched his canteen from the truck. He shook it gently, only half full. He had planned to save the rest for the morning's work in the fields, but when he looked at the horse, the thought of rationing felt small. He crouched beside it, unscrewed the cap, and tipped the canteen slowly. "Easy," he whispered, as though speaking to a child. Drops slid across the horse's cracked lips. At first there was no response. Then the nostrils flared faintly. The lips trembled, brushing against his palm, and with a weak effort, the horse's tongue lapped at the trickle of water. Daniel froze, caught by the moment. The feel of roughness against his skin, the desperate but careful way the animal drank. It was like watching life return one fragile sip at a time. He steadied the canteen, letting the stream fall in thin lines until the last drop was gone. When it was finished, the horse exhaled a sound that was almost human in its relief. A low sigh pressed into the straw. "Good boy," Daniel murmured, though he had not yet thought of a name. His voice cracked from disuse, but for once he didn't mind. He leaned back on his heels, studying the animal. Up close, he saw more than weakness. The scars across its back spoke of work too hard and hands too cruel. The cloudiness of its eyes spoke of years that had not been kind. Yet in the gaze that lingered on him now, faint though it was, there was no surrender. Something in that recognition tightened Daniel's throat. Memories returned in flashes. The nights he had sat in silence at the kitchen table, the way neighbors offered condolences that sounded more like obligations, the empty chair that never seemed to fade from his sight. His boy had always believed in saving things. Stray dogs, broken tools, even a sparrow with a bent wing. "Everything deserves a chance, Dad," he used to say, holding the bird with both hands, as though it were a secret too delicate to share. Daniel's chest ached as he brushed his thumb over the rim of the empty canteen. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe the horse would not live another day. But for the first time in years, foolishness felt like hope. He fetched a crust of bread from the counter inside his kitchen, torn from a loaf he had baked days earlier. It was stale, but he softened it in warm water and carried it back to the stable. Breaking it into small pieces, he held one out on his palm. The horse sniffed weakly, then nibbled, chewing slow, eyes never leaving his face. "You've been left behind," Daniel whispered, voice unsteady. "Same as me." The horse flicked an ear, and Daniel found himself leaning closer, as though the creature might understand more than he dared believe. Hours passed in a rhythm of small offerings. Water gathered from the pump, bits of softened bread, strokes along the tangled mane. Each gesture was met not with gratitude, but with a quiet persistence, the kind of endurance Daniel recognized in himself. By late morning, the sun poured through the gaps in the stable's roof, laying stripes of light across the straw. Dust floated in the beams, golden and fragile. The horse shifted suddenly, muscles trembling as it tried to rise. Its hooves scraped the floor, pushing, failing, pushing again. Daniel moved quickly, sliding to cradle its head against his thigh. "Easy," he said, steadying the weight. "Not yet." One step at a time, the horse's chest heaved, breath rattling like an old machine refusing to quit. Then, with a final effort, it lifted halfway to its knees before collapsing again. The dust rose around them, catching in the sun. Daniel stroked the animal's neck, feeling the weak pulse beneath. "You're still here," he murmured. "That's enough." Outside, the world carried on. A neighbor's tractor rumbled faintly across the distance. Birds darted from fence to fence, their cries sharp against the air. But inside the stable, time seemed to still. It was just one man and one horse, each tethered by the same unspoken question. What comes after survival? Daniel didn't know the answer. But as he sat there, the horse's breath warming his hand, he felt a shift inside him, subtle as the turning of soil under a plow. For the first time in years, he was not entirely alone. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, when Daniel decided it was time to test whether the horse could travel farther than the length of the stall. He had spent most of the day moving quietly in and out of the stable, fetching water, brushing dust from the coarse coat, and speaking in low tones that surprised even him. Words had been strangers on his tongue for years, yet around this animal, they seemed to return like forgotten tools pulled from an old shed. He slid the rope gently around the horse's halter. The leather was cracked from neglect, but it held. "Come on," Daniel murmured. "Let's try." His voice wasn't commanding. It was patient, steady, the way he might have spoken to his boy when teaching him to walk beside the plow. The horse shifted its weight, ears flicking nervously. Its legs trembled as it braced to rise. Daniel steadied the movement with his shoulder pressed firm against its side. With a grunt, the animal forced itself upright, wobbling, swaying dangerously before finding balance. Daniel's boots sank slightly in the straw as he leaned his weight into support. Together, they stepped out into the fading light. The farm spread wide before them, fields stretching golden and brittle, fences leaning from seasons of storms, the distant windmill slicing the sky with its slow spin. The sight was both familiar and changed. For years, Daniel had looked at this land and seen only emptiness. Now, walking with the fragile rhythm of hooves beside him, he felt the place breathe again. The road leading from the stable to the farmhouse was short, lined with cottonwoods that whispered in the wind. Daniel guided the horse along it, one hand firm on the rope, the other ready to steady if it faltered. At first, every step was a struggle. The horse's hooves scraped against the dirt, knees buckling slightly. But then came another step, and another, until the sound of slow, uneven hoofbeats joined the crunch of Daniel's boots. He found himself whispering encouragement. "That's it. Steady now. Just one more." The words echoed softly under the canopy of trees, drifting away like prayers that needed no answer. Halfway down the path, the horse stumbled, nearly collapsing. Daniel caught it with his arm braced hard against its flank. His muscles screamed, but he didn't let go. "Not yet," he said through clenched teeth. "You're not done yet." The animal lifted its head, breath rasping, eyes fixed on him with a clarity that startled him. It was as if the creature understood, as if it had decided to borrow his strength just long enough to keep moving. They made it to the farmhouse porch at last. Daniel stopped, both of them panting, sweat dampening his shirt, dust clinging to the horse's coat. He glanced at the house, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust. For years it had been nothing but walls around his grief. Now, standing there with this battered animal at his side, he felt the silence shift. From across the road, movement caught his eye. Sarah Miller, his neighbor, stood near her fence with a basket of laundry balanced against her hip. She had been watching, though she tried not to make it obvious. Their eyes met for a moment. She gave the faintest nod, a quiet acknowledgement, before turning back to hang a shirt on the line. Daniel looked away quickly, uncomfortable with being seen. He tugged gently on the rope, guiding the horse back toward the stable. The return walk was slower, but steadier. Dust rose around their legs in soft clouds, glowing orange in the evening light. Shadows stretched long across the farmyard, two figures stitched together against the earth. One man, one horse, both carrying scars invisible to the rest of the world. When they reached the stable again, the horse lowered itself awkwardly onto the straw, exhaling in exhaustion. Daniel removed the rope and crouched beside it. He pressed a hand against the rough neck, feeling the pulse that still beat there. Faint, but alive. "Not bad," he said quietly. "Not bad at all." The sky deepened into dusk. Crickets sang their steady chorus, and the first stars appeared above the plains. Daniel leaned against the stable door, arms crossed, eyes lingering on the animal inside. He knew the road ahead would be long, full of nights like this one. Tending, waiting, wondering if it was worth it. But for the first time in years, he felt something stir beneath the weariness. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was something smaller, quieter. The possibility of it, and as the night settled around the farm, Daniel realized he had begun to carry not just the weight of his own sorrow, but the fragile hope of another life as well. The next morning broke clear, the air cool with the faint scent of dew settling over the fields. The horizon glowed in shades of pink and lavender, the kind of sunrise that usually passed Daniel by as he trudged through another day of chores. But today, he stood outside the stable, pausing longer than usual, as if waiting for a signal that hadn't yet come. Inside, the horse stirred. The sound was faint at first, the shuffle of hooves against straw, the rustle of breath pushing through tired lungs. Daniel pushed open the door, light spilling across the dim space. The sight met him like an ache and a promise. The horse was still alive. Its head lifted slowly, ears flicking toward him, eyes clouded but alert enough to track his movement. Daniel stepped inside, carrying a bucket of water fresh from the pump. He set it down carefully, the wood slats creaking under his weight. The horse lowered its muzzle, drinking slow but steady. Each swallow was a small victory. Each drop proof that yesterday's effort hadn't been in vain. Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching in silence. For years, his mornings had begun with machines, the whir of engines, the clatter of metal. This morning, it began with breath and water. Somehow, it felt more like living. When the horse finished, Daniel reached for the brush he had found buried under old tools. The bristles were worn, The handle cracked, but it would do. He started gently along the animal's neck, working through tangles, dust rising in soft clouds. The horse flinched at first, muscles twitching under his touch, but Daniel didn't rush. He moved slow, patient, his hands steady despite the memories tugging at him. As he brushed, he found scars he hadn't noticed before. Thin lines crisscrossed the back, pale against the dark coat, reminders of years that had stripped the creature down to bone and willpower. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen marks like these on broken tools, on fences weathered by storms, but never should they have belonged to a living thing. "You deserved better," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the horse or himself. Hours passed as he worked. He cleared old straw, replaced it with fresh bales hauled from the loft, patched gaps in the roof where sunlight sliced too sharply. The stable had long stood as a forgotten corner of the farm, left to rot along with the parts of his life he couldn't face. Now, plank by plank, it began to change. The smell of clean hay filled the air, mixing with the warm musk of horse and earth. It wasn't perfect. Nothing on his farm ever was, but it was alive again. By midday, sweat clung to Daniel's skin, streaking the dust on his arms. He stepped back, wiping his brow with his sleeve. The stable looked different. Not new, not polished, but tended for the first time since his son's laughter had echoed here. The space felt like it held a purpose again. The horse shifted, lowering itself onto the fresh bedding with a groan of relief. Daniel crouched beside it, resting a hand lightly against its shoulder. The animal's breath steadied, slow and even, eyes half closing in something close to rest. Daniel exhaled, the knot in his chest loosening. He had built fences and barns, repaired tractors, harvested fields that stretched farther than sight. But this, kneeling beside a creature that had nearly been discarded by the world, felt like his most important work. Outside, the hum of the town carried faintly on the wind. A wagon clattered down the road. Voices rose and fell in conversation. Someone laughed, the sound sharp and distant. Daniel knew what they would say if they saw him here. Crazy farmer, wasting his time on a dying horse. He had heard the same tone after the accident, when neighbors whispered that he would never be the same, that the farm would crumble under his silence. But as he looked at the horse now, its chest rising and falling with stubborn persistence, Daniel felt a rare defiance stir in him. Let them talk. They hadn't seen the eyes that refused to close. They hadn't felt the fragile weight pressing against his hand, asking for nothing more than a chance. The afternoon light slanted across the fields, spilling gold into the stable. Dust motes floated in the beams, glowing like fragments of memory. Daniel sat back on his heels, tired but lighter than he had been in years. "You're still here," he said quietly. "And so am I." The horse flicked an ear, as though answering. That night, as Daniel leaned against the stable door, listening to the rhythm of breathing inside, he realized something had shifted in more than just the building. The farm was no longer silent in the same way. The grief still lingered, sharp at the edges, but beneath it ran a new current. Thin, unsteady, but alive. The stable had awakened. And with it, so had he. By the third day, the horse's breathing had steadied, though every rise and fall of its ribs still looked like a question without an answer. Daniel knew enough about animals to see what lingered beneath. Weakness clinging like a shadow, joints swollen from overwork, a body thinned by neglect. He could keep brushing, keep feeding bits of softened bread and buckets of water, but deep down he understood that what was broken here wasn't something a farmer's stubbornness alone could fix. That afternoon, he stood at the edge of his yard, hat in hand, watching the dust cloud of a truck rolling up the road. The sound carried before the sight, the deep growl of an engine too old for speed, but steady enough for reliability. Dr. Walter Howard pulled into the drive, tires crunching over gravel. The vet climbed out with the deliberate slowness of a man who'd seen more than his share of hurt. His hair was silver at the temples, his shirt sleeves rolled high, and his leather bag swung at his side with the weight of 100 visits just like this. He nodded once at Daniel, eyes narrowing toward the stable. "You said it was bad," Howard muttered, voice low. "Let's see." Daniel led him inside. The doctor's boots clicked softly against the planks. The horse lay in the straw, lifting its head faintly as they approached. Howard crouched, hands moving with practiced certainty. He pressed along the ribs, traced the lines of scar tissue, checked the eyes clouded but not empty. His jaw tightened as he lifted a hoof, testing the joint with a firm but careful grip. After a long silence, Howard stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. "It's worse than bad," he said flatly. "He's starved near to death. Half his joints are swollen from work he was never built for. These marks here," he gestured toward the pale scars. "That's a whip, not a fall." Whoever had him before drove him until he broke Daniel's throat tightened. He looked at the horse, lying still but watching, its ears flicking at the sound of their voices. "So what do I do?" Howard sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's no easy road. He needs medicine, good feed, time, and time's the part most folks don't have patience for." His eyes flicked to Daniel, not unkind but sharp enough to cut through hesitation. "You have to decide if you're willing to see this through. It won't be quick, and it sure as hell won't be cheap." Daniel thought of the coins rattling in his pocket, the stack of unpaid bills in the drawer by the sink, the lean rows of corn that barely promised enough to sell. His silence was answer enough. Howard studied him, then glanced back at the horse. The animal shifted faintly, eyes steady on Daniel. Something passed between man and beast in that look, something the doctor didn't miss. "You know," Howard said more gently, "most people would have kept driving. Would have said it wasn't their problem. But you stopped. That counts for something." Daniel pressed his lips together, his hand brushing along the horse's mane. "I couldn't leave him." The vet gave a short nod, then bent to his bag. He pulled out bottles, a syringe, jars that smelled sharp with iodine. "I'll start him on fluids, give something for the pain. Ointment for the sores, if you can manage to apply it regularly. But this is just the first step. You'll need to work like hell to keep him alive." Daniel held the horse's head steady as the needle slid into skin. The animal flinched, muscles tightening, but its eyes never left Daniel's face. Daniel murmured softly, words that weren't so much comfort as a promise. "I've got you. I'm here." When the injection was done, the horse sagged back into the straw, trembling but calmer. Howard packed his bag with slow precision, then straightened. "I won't lie to you. If he makes it, it'll be because you didn't quit when it looked hopeless. But I'll help where I can." Daniel nodded once, unable to speak past the tightness in his chest. The doctor paused at the door, turning back. "You give him another chance," he said. "Might be you're giving yourself one too." When the truck rumbled away, Daniel stood alone again in the stable, the weight of the words hanging heavy. He sank onto the straw beside the horse, fingers threading gently through its mane. The animal exhaled, warm breath brushing against his arm. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't salvation. But it was a start. And for Daniel, that was enough to keep going. The following evenings unfolded with the rhythm of quiet labor. Daniel rose at dawn, tended the fields, then returned to the stable with the steadiness of someone who no longer moved only for himself. Each night, he sat beside the horse, brushing its coat, massaging ointment into the raw lines of its skin, whispering words that seemed to soften the air around them. The routine was slow, unremarkable to anyone else, but to Daniel it was the first time since the accident that his days carried more than emptiness. Sarah Miller noticed. From her porch across the road, she could see the glow of the lantern inside the stable long after the sun had dipped behind the cottonwoods. She would be hanging laundry or shelling beans when her gaze drifted to that light, steady as a heartbeat. In the quiet of her widowhood, she had learned to watch the world without expecting much from it. But the sight of Daniel moving in and out of that forgotten building stirred something, curiosity at first, then a quiet pull she couldn't name. One afternoon, as the wind tossed the sheets on her line, Sarah carried a basket across the road. Daniel was bent over a bucket, rinsing cloths in water that had turned cloudy with medicine. He glanced up when she approached, his expression wary, as if bracing for judgment. "You've taken on quite the project," she said, her voice gentle but edged with practicality. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving damp streaks. "Just doing what I can." Sarah peered past him into the stall. The horse lay in the straw, sides heaving with slow breaths. Its coat, though still rough, had begun to carry a faint sheen under the patches Daniel had brushed clean. Its eyes followed her, tired but alert. "You'll wear yourself out," she said softly. "Better than doing nothing," Daniel replied, almost too quickly. There was silence between them for a moment. Then Sarah reached into her basket and pulled out a loaf wrapped in cloth. "I made cornbread this morning." "Thought you could use it." Daniel hesitated before taking it. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and he looked away, muttering a quiet thanks. It had been a long time since anyone had offered him something without asking for work in return. Sarah lingered, studying him. His shoulders were broad but bent, his eyes shadowed by years of silence. Yet when he turned back, toward the horse, there was a gentleness in his movements she had never noticed before. "You know," she said, her tone thoughtful, "most men would have left that animal where they found it." Not many would bring it home. Daniel didn't answer right away. He rested his hand on the horse's neck, thumb brushing through the tangled mane. "I've left enough behind," he said finally, the words heavy with more than their surface meaning. Sarah didn't press. She only nodded, then stepped back toward the fence. As she walked away, Daniel watched her go, unsettled by how easily she seemed to see through him. That night, as he sat outside the stable with the cornbread beside him, he thought about the way Sarah had spoken. Not with pity, not with mockery, but with a kind of plain respect. It unsettled him almost as much as the bond forming with the horse. For years, he had hidden behind silence, letting the town decide what it thought of him. Now, with one neighbor's glance, he felt the walls shift. Inside, the horse stirred. It lifted its head, ears flicking toward the sound of crickets in the yard, then toward Daniel's voice as he murmured, "Easy now. You're not alone." The animal exhaled, settling again. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, breaking a piece of cornbread in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt the faint hum of community pressing against the edges of his solitude. Not the gossip of the town, but the quiet recognition of someone who had also known loss. The lantern light flickered, throwing shadows across the stable walls. Daniel chewed in silence, his gaze drifting between the horse and the neighbor's house across the road, where a single lamp burned against the darkness. Something had shifted again, not as sharp as grief, not as sudden as discovery, but steady, like roots finding purchase in soil that had been left barren too long. And though he would not have said it aloud, Daniel felt it. The farm was no longer just his to endure. For the first time, it felt like a place where healing might take root. For days, Daniel moved through a rhythm that was beginning to feel almost like purpose. Morning in the fields, evening in the stable, nights leaning against the doorway with the lantern light at his back. The horse was still weak, but something in its posture had changed. It no longer lay like a body waiting for the end. Instead, it lifted its head when Daniel approached, ears twitching at the sound of his boots. That flicker of recognition carried more weight than any medicine. On the fourth evening after Dr. Howard's visit, Daniel sat on a bale of hay, elbows resting on his knees, watching the horse chew slowly at softened oats. The sound was steady, almost calming, like rain on a tin roof. He found himself speaking into the quiet, his voice low, meant for no one, and yet heard by both of them. "You need a name," he said. The word startled him. It had been years since he'd named anything. Livestock, tools, even the new tractor parts he bought came without the small ritual he used to share with his boy. Names were too personal, too binding. But now, watching this creature stand shaky but determined under the glow of the lantern, Daniel felt the urge to call it something more than the horse. He studied the animal, the way its black coat caught the light in dull, uneven patches, the scars that mapped its body like forgotten roads. In the half-dark, its form looked less like a living beast and more like a shadow stitched to the earth, refusing to lift. "Shadow," Daniel murmured. The horse raised its head, ears flicking at the sound. Its gaze met his, clouded but intent, as though the name had reached a place deeper than words. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He tried again, firmer this time. "Shadow." The horse shifted its weight, exhaling through its nostrils, and for the briefest moment, Daniel thought he saw understanding. The name settled between them, not chosen so much as revealed. Shadow. The shape that follows, the presence that lingers even when light fades. It felt right, not just for the animal, but for himself. Both of them had lived as shadows in their own way. Overlooked, half forgotten, existing but not fully seen. That night, as Daniel extinguished the lantern and stepped outside, he whispered the name once more into the open air. The crickets carried it into the fields, the cottonwoods bent with the breeze, and in the dark stable behind him, the horse shifted as if answering. The days that followed were still hard. Shadow stumbled often, legs trembling as though they belonged to a colt just learning to stand. Daniel coaxed him through each step, steadying his weight with a patience that surprised him. He had never been known for patience before. He'd been the man who worked harder, pushed faster, demanded more from soil and machine alike. But with Shadow, he found himself slowing, learning the rhythm of recovery. Neighbors whispered when they saw him. At the feed store, a man shook his head. "That horse won't last a month," he muttered loud enough for Daniel to hear. Another smirked. Guess he's found a new way to waste time. Daniel didn't answer. He had stopped answering years ago, when the town's pity turned into avoidance. But this time, their words didn't burrow under his skin. Each night, Shadow still lifted his head when Daniel came near, and that was enough. Sarah noticed, too. She began appearing at the fence more often, sometimes with a pie wrapped in a cloth, sometimes just leaning against the posts with her arms crossed. She never lingered long, but she always looked toward the stable, her eyes narrowing with something like approval. One evening, as Daniel brushed Shadow's coat under the soft glow of lantern light, Sarah called across the road. "What do you call him?" Daniel hesitated, the brush pausing in his hand. "Shadow," he answered. She tilted, her head considering. Fitting. Daniel didn't say more, but when he turned back, Shadow's ears had flicked toward the sound of his name, and for the first time in years, Daniel almost smiled. Later that night, as the farm sank into silence, Daniel sat on the porch steps, staring out at the fields. He thought about names, the way his boy had once named every stray dog, every calf born in spring. Names had been hope back then, a way of saying, "You matter enough to be called." Now, with Shadow breathing steady in the stable, Daniel felt that same fragile hope stirring again. For the first time in years, he believed that something broken could still be worth saving. The first weeks of September brought cooler mornings, the kind that carried mist along the edges of the fields. Daniel rose earlier than usual, his boots crunching over damp earth as he made his way to the stable. Inside, Shadow was waiting, head lifting at the sound of his footsteps. The sight steadied something in Daniel's chest. Fragile, but real, like a candle flame fighting against the dark. But healing was never a straight road. That afternoon, while Daniel spread fresh straw, Shadow stumbled trying to stand. His knees buckled sharply, his whole body crashing down into the bedding. The sound struck Daniel like a hammer blow. He dropped the pitchfork and rushed forward, kneeling in the dust. "Easy, boy. Easy," he whispered, but his voice shook. He slid an arm beneath the horse's neck, trying to brace the weight, but Shadow only groaned, sides heaving as though every breath might be the last. The moment cracked something open in Daniel. His throat burned, and before he could stop himself, words tore out, raw and jagged. "Why did I even try?" "Why?" His hands trembled against the animal's skin. "I couldn't save him. I couldn't save my boy, and now I can't save you either." The confession echoed in the stable, heavy and unyielding. For years, Daniel had locked those words inside, burying them beneath chores and silence. But now, crouched in the straw beside a creature too weak to rise, the dam broke. His shoulders shook as grief poured out. The accident, the sirens, the way the town's pity turned into distance. He pressed his forehead against Shadow's coarse mane, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I failed him. I'll fail you too." Shadow shifted faintly, breath ragged, eyes cloudy. Then, with a trembling effort, he lifted his head, pressing it against Daniel's shoulder. It wasn't strength, not really. It was something else. An insistence on connection, even in weakness. Daniel froze, tears cutting through the dust on his face. The pressure of that weight against him felt like more than survival. It felt like forgiveness. He wrapped an arm around the horse's neck, clutching tight. "Not you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Not this time." Outside, the sky had darkened with the build of a late summer storm. Thunder rolled low across the plains, rattling the windows of the farmhouse. The smell of rain seeped into the air. Daniel sat there long after Shadow's breathing steadied, the storm pressing closer, his body aching from both exhaustion and release. By evening, the rain broke. Sheets of water hammered the roof of the stable, dripping through cracks Daniel hadn't yet patched. He stayed inside, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, Shadow lying close enough that his warmth seeped into Daniel's side. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scars on Shadow's back, the scars in Daniel's eyes. For once, neither tried to hide. The storm passed slowly, leaving the air cool and clean. Shadow dozed, head resting near Daniel's boots. Daniel leaned forward, brushing a hand through the damp mane. "You're tougher than me," he said quietly, a trace of weary admiration in his voice. When dawn returned, pale light spilling across wet fields, Shadow was still breathing, still watching. Daniel stood stiffly, every muscle sore from the night before, but his chest felt strangely lighter. He had spoken what he never thought he could. The words had not fixed anything, had not brought his boy back, but they had broken the silence that had strangled him for years. From that day forward, something shifted in their bond. Daniel no longer spoke only to fill the air. He spoke because he believed Shadow heard him, not with ears, but with the quiet understanding of two survivors who had seen too much and yet chosen to remain. The farm was still a place of hardship, the town still a place of gossip. But in the stable, amid the smell of hay and the echoes of storm, Daniel had found a companion strong enough to bear the weight of his truth. And Shadow, though still frail, had found a reason to rise again. The storm that had cracked open Daniel's silence was only a rehearsal for the one that arrived a week later. September in Kansas was fickle. Skies could glow soft and golden one moment, then bruise black with thunderclouds the next. That afternoon, the air felt heavy, the kind that prickled skin and whispered of something dangerous coming. The wind carried the smell of rain long before it fell. Daniel was mending a section of fence when he noticed the sudden hush. Birds vanished from the wires, the fields went strangely still. He glanced toward the horizon and saw the wall of clouds rolling fast, the color of slate. By the time he reached the stable, the first drops were already splattering the dust, darkening it to patches of mud. Shadow stood inside, restless. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring at the scent of the storm. Daniel closed the door against the rising wind, then crouched near him, rubbing a calming hand along his neck. "We'll ride it out," he murmured. But the storm was no gentle visitor. Lightning clawed across the sky, followed by thunder that shook the boards loose in their nails. Rain hammered the roof in torrents, finding every gap, every seam Daniel hadn't yet patched. Water spilled through, soaking the straw until it squelched underfoot. The stable groaned with the weight of wind. Outside, a sharp crack split the air. Daniel rushed to the doorway in time to see part of the neighbor's cattle shed buckle under the force of the gust. The roof sagged, and he heard the faint bawling of calves inside. His stomach clenched. Sarah's herd. Without thinking, he grabbed a lantern and splashed through the rain, Shadow's frightened whinny echoing behind him. The path to Sarah's shed was a mire of mud, sucking at his boots, but he forced his way through. The structure leaned badly, its door jammed by fallen boards. Inside, the cries of the calves grew louder, panicked. Daniel shoved at the door, but it wouldn't budge. He needed more strength, more leverage. He turned back, squinting through the downpour. Shadow stood outside the stable, trembling, head high against the storm. Somehow, the halter rope had slipped loose. The horse pawed the ground, muscles taut, eyes wide at the flashes of lightning. Daniel's first instinct was fear. Shadow was still too weak. To push him now would be cruel, maybe even fatal. But then he saw the calves' shadows flickering inside the broken shed, heard their cries over the roar of the storm. There wasn't time to think. He waded back to Shadow, gripping the rope with hands slick from rain. "I need you," he said, voice low, urgent. The horse's ears flicked, body shivering. Daniel pressed his forehead briefly to the wet curve of its cheek. "Just try." Together they dragged through the mud, Daniel leading, Shadow following with faltering steps. When they reached the shed, Daniel looped the rope around the jammed door. He braced his body, pushing at Shadow's flank. "Pull!" he urged. At first, nothing happened. The rope strained, mud sucked at hooves. Shadow stumbled, nearly dropping. Daniel's heart clenched. "Come on, boy." "One more." He pulled alongside him, teeth gritted, muscles burning. Shadow snorted, lowered his head, and leaned forward. The door creaked, then jerked, then tore free with a shuddering crack. The calves stumbled out, their small bodies slick with rain, bleating in fright. Sarah appeared from the far side of the yard, her hair plastered to her face, eyes wide with fear and relief. "Daniel!" she shouted over the wind. He nodded once, too breathless for words, guiding the calves toward safer ground. Shadow sagged against his weight, chest heaving, sides trembling. Daniel steadied him with both arms, whispering through the storm, "You did it." That's enough. By the time the worst had passed, the shed lay in ruins, the yard a churn of mud and debris, but the calves were alive. Sarah stood beside him, water dripping from her clothes, her hand briefly resting on his arm. "You saved them," she said, her voice breaking. Then, with a glance at Shadow, she added softly, "Both of you." Daniel looked at the horse leaning into him, too exhausted to stand straight but still upright. In the flicker of lightning, Shadow's eyes shone not with fear, but with something fiercer. Defiance. When the storm finally moved east, leaving only the hiss of rain and the smell of soaked earth, Daniel led Shadow back to the stable. Every step was slow, careful, but they made it. Inside, he rubbed the horse down with a rag, drying him as best he could. Shadow leaned heavily against his shoulder, not out of weakness alone, but as though choosing him as an anchor. Daniel whispered, almost to himself, "Not just surviving anymore." The words hung in the damp air, fragile as the flame of the lantern. For the first time, Daniel believed them. The storm had left the land soaked and bent, but not broken. For days afterward, the town spoke in low voices about the wrecked shed and the calves pulled to safety. Sarah's gratitude spread quietly through her words at the diner, through neighbors who saw Daniel and Shadow walking the fence line together. Whispers began to change. Where once people had muttered crazy farmer and waste of time, some now said, "Maybe there's more to it than we thought." But whispers traveled farther than truth, and they reached ears Daniel wished had stayed deaf. It was a Saturday morning when the sound of tires on gravel broke the quiet. Daniel had been spreading fresh hay when he heard the engine, sharper and meaner than Dr. Howard's steady truck. He stepped outside the stable, wiping his hands on his jeans, and saw a glossy black pickup roll to a stop at the edge of the yard. The door swung open, and a man stepped out. Jacob Reed. His boots hit the ground with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. Broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with a jaw set like stone, and a gaze that scanned the farm as if it already belonged to him. He carried a folder in one hand, papers jutting out like weapons. "Well," Reed said, his voice oily but firm. "So, this is where he ended up." Daniel's shoulders tensed. "What do you want?" Reed's eyes cut toward the stable. Shadow stirred inside, ears flicking at the unfamiliar tone. "That horse," Reed said, tilting his chin. "He was mine. Bought and paid for. I've got the bill of sale right here." He slapped the folder against his palm for emphasis. "Whatever you've been doing with him, it doesn't change a thing." "He's still my property." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You left him to die." Reed smirked. "A man's got to run his business. He couldn't keep up. Not my fault he wasn't worth the feed." His eyes narrowed. "But I hear he's proving useful again. Which means he has value. Which means he comes back with me." The words struck Daniel like fists. He stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "He's not going anywhere." The tension thickened between them, the air heavy with the echo of rain still dripping from the eaves. From across the road, Sarah appeared, drawn by the raised voices. She stopped at the fence, arms crossed, watching with sharp eyes. Reed caught the movement and raised his voice, turning so she could hear. "This isn't sentiment. This is law. Property doesn't stop being property just because a fool decides to pick it off the roadside." Shadow shifted inside the stable, nostrils flaring, body trembling at the sound of Reed's voice. The horse pressed against the back wall as though remembering something it had tried to forget. Daniel noticed, and his anger deepened. "You're not taking him," Daniel said. Reed's smile vanished. He flipped open the folder, pulling out a crumpled bill of sale, ink faded but legible. "This says otherwise." "You think some sob story is stronger than paper? Sheriff will back me up? Court'll back me up? You've got nothing." Sarah's voice carried across the yard, sharp and steady. "He's not yours anymore. Everyone knows you abandoned him." Reed's eyes snapped toward her, but Daniel stepped into his line of sight. "Get off my land," he said quietly, each word deliberate. For a long moment, Reed didn't move. Then his lips curved in something colder than a smile. "This isn't finished," he said, sliding the papers back into the folder. "You can play farmer hero all you want, but I'll come back with the law. And when I do, you'll watch me lead him away." He turned on his heel, boots grinding against the wet gravel, and climbed back into the truck. The engine roared to life, spitting mud as he drove off, leaving the air thick with exhaust and threat. Daniel stood rooted, fists clenched at his sides. Inside the stable, Shadow whinnied, a sharp, broken sound that cut through him. He turned quickly, stepping inside to find the horse pressed against the wall. Body quaking. Daniel placed a steady hand on its neck, murmuring low. "He's gone. You're safe. You're not going back." Sarah's voice drifted from the fence. "He'll make good on it, you know. Men like him don't bluff." Daniel stroked Shadow's mane, his jaw set. "Then we'll fight. However we have to." The stable was quiet, except for the sound of rainwater dripping from the roof, the horse's uneven breath, and the pounding certainty in Daniel's chest. The fight wasn't just for Shadow anymore. It was for both of them. Against the weight of law, against the cruelty of men who saw life only in terms of worth. Against the silence that had once swallowed Daniel whole. And as he stood there, Shadow trembling under his hand, Daniel realized he wasn't afraid of the fight. Not anymore. The following week brought no peace. Daniel carried on with his chores, but each sound of an approaching engine set his shoulders rigid. Shadow had grown steadier since the storm, though his body still bore every mile of his suffering. Yet when the horse lifted his head to meet Daniel's gaze, there was trust there, the kind that could not be measured in paper or law. But Jacob Reed's visit had left a shadow over the farm heavier than the horse's namesake. And it didn't take long for that shadow to stretch across the whole town. It began in the diner. Sarah overheard it first while pouring coffee at a back table. Two men bent over their mugs, voices pitched low but sharp. "Law's law," one said, stirring sugar. "If Reed's got papers, that horse is his." The other shook his head. "You didn't see the storm. That animal pulled down a door, sit calves. Doesn't sound like Reed's horse anymore." By the next morning, the debate spilled into the feed store. Farmers lingered longer than usual, leaning on sacks of seed while trading arguments. "If we start tossing out ownership just because someone feels bad," a rancher grumbled, "what's to stop anyone from claiming what isn't theirs?" Across the counter, another man countered, "You call leaving a horse to starve ownership?" That farmer gave it a second life. Maybe that counts for more than ink on a page. The talk spread fast, carried on the prairie wind until the whole of town buzzed with it. At the post office, women shook their heads in line, muttering about cruelty and compassion. At the hardware store, voices rose enough to echo off the walls. And when Daniel walked down Main Street one afternoon to buy liniment, heads turned. Some nodded in quiet respect. Others shook with disapproval. He felt every glance. Sheriff Markham came to the farm not long after, his broad frame filling the doorway of the stable. The man was steady as the oak trees by the courthouse, his badge gleaming against his vest. "Ward," he said, voice even, "you know I've got to keep order." Reed's filed notice with the county. "Until there's a hearing, the horse stays here under your care. But understand me, this isn't settled." Daniel nodded, jaw tight. "I figured as much." The sheriff's gaze flicked toward Shadow, who stood close by, ears flicking at the sound of their voices. "He looks better than the last time I saw him." "He's alive," Daniel said simply. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Sometimes that's enough." Then he left, boots crunching against the gravel, leaving the weight of law behind him like dust. That night, Sarah came by with a kettle of stew. She lingered in the doorway of the stable, watching Daniel spoon-feed shadow-softened oats. "They're talking about you everywhere," she said. Daniel didn't look up. "They always have." "This is different," she said quietly. "Before it was pity. Now it's division. Half the town thinks you're a fool clinging to something broken. The other half thinks you're the only one who remembered compassion." Daniel's hand paused against Shadow's neck. The horse leaned into his touch, steady and calm despite the storm of voices beyond the farm. He exhaled slowly. "I didn't do it for them." Sarah studied him, eyes soft in the lantern glow. "No," she said, "but they'll be watching anyway." And they were. When the town hall meeting was called, the benches filled long before dusk. Farmers with mud still on their boots, women clutching shawls, children peeking wide-eyed from behind skirts. The air buzzed with anticipation, a hunger for spectacle as much as justice. Sheriff Markham stood at the front, gavel in hand, his presence heavy with authority. Daniel entered quietly, rope in hand. At the other end, Shadow followed, hooves clopping slow against the wooden floor. Conversation stilled, heads turning. The horse's scars caught the lantern light, a map of cruelty written across its frame. But his eyes, though clouded, held steady as he walked beside Daniel. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A child whispered, "That's him, the horse that saved the calves." Another voice cut sharper. "Doesn't matter. Paper's paper." Daniel guided Shadow to the side wall, resting a hand on his neck. The horse lowered his head, calm in the press of bodies and sound. For Daniel, it was proof enough. This creature trusted him, even in the heart of judgment. Sheriff Markham banged the gavel. "We're here to speak plain before the court hearing. Say your piece, and let it be recorded." One by one, voices rose. A rancher stood first, arguing for Reed, his voice thick with the certainty of law. Then Sarah spoke, apron still dusted from baking, her words carrying clear. "This isn't just about property. It's about who we are. That horse was left to die. Daniel Ward gave him another chance. If we hand him back, we're not just condemning the horse. We're condemning ourselves." Applause broke, sharp and swelling, before fading again into murmurs. As the debate raged, Daniel stood silent, hand firm on Shadow's neck. He had nothing polished to say, no legal words to lean on. But when Shadow lifted his head and pressed his muzzle gently against his shoulder in front of everyone, the hall quieted, as though it had heard the truest testimony. No one missed it. And though the law had yet to speak, the town had begun to choose. The county courthouse was not an imposing building. It stood at the edge of the square, clapboard walls weathered gray, the white paint flaking under years of prairie wind. Yet that morning, it seemed to hold the gravity of a cathedral. Farmers, merchants, ranch hands, and their families crowded the steps, their breath rising in the autumn chill. The American flag snapped sharply above, its sound cutting through the murmur of voices. Daniel arrived on foot, Shadow walking slow at his side. The horse's hooves clopped against the boards of the street, each sound echoing louder than it should. People parted as they passed, some with eyes full of quiet respect, others with the guarded suspicion of those who had already chosen Reed's side. Daniel kept his gaze low, one hand firm on the rope, the other resting briefly on Shadow's neck whenever the horse faltered. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of bodies, lanterns hanging from iron hooks casting long shadows across the paneled walls. Sheriff Markham stood near the front, arms folded, his eyes steady as Daniel entered. Sarah sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Howard was beside her, his leather bag resting at his feet, spectacles catching the light. At the opposite table sat Jacob Reed, his posture straight, his black coat gleaming as though polished just for this day. Beside him, a lawyer in a crisp suit shuffled papers with the cool precision of someone who dealt in contracts more than conscience. Reed's eyes found Daniel across the room, and the faint curl of his lips carried all the smugness of a man convinced the outcome was already his. Judge Whitaker entered, his robe heavy against his thin frame, silver hair neatly combed. He banged the gavel once, and the room stilled. "This court will now hear the matter of ownership regarding the animal in question." Reed's lawyer rose first, voice smooth as oil. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. My client, Mr. Reed, purchased the horse legally. Here is the bill of sale, signed and dated." He placed the paper on the judge's desk, the sound of it crisp in the quiet. Ownership was established, and though the animal was left unattended, abandonment does not dissolve legal rights. To decide otherwise would invite chaos, men taking whatever they please under the guise of pity. The words rippled through the gallery, drawing nods from some, frowns from others. The lawyer sat with the certainty of someone who had done this many times before. Judge Whitaker turned his gaze toward Daniel. "Mr. Ward, do you have representation?" Daniel shook his head. His voice was low but steady. "No, Your Honor." Just the truth. He stood, his boots scuffing the wood, and looked at the judge directly. "When I found him, he was lying in a ditch. Skin and bone. Dying. Reed didn't leave him unattended. He threw him away. I gave him water when I had little for myself. I fed him. I tended his wounds. He walks beside me because he chooses to, not because I bought him." Murmurs swelled in the room, some voices soft with agreement, others muttering disapproval. Dr. Howard rose next, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I examined the horse the day Ward brought him in. Malnourished, joints swollen, scars consistent with whipping. That wasn't neglect of weeks. That was years of abuse. If he'd been left where Reed abandoned him, he'd be dead. If he's alive now, it's because Ward worked night and day to keep him that way." He sat again, adjusting his spectacles, his words hanging heavy in the silence. From the front row, Sarah stood, her voice clear despite the tremor in her hands. "I saw it too. That horse was covered in Daniel's jacket the first night while he slept outside, on the porch. He gave up his own comfort for him. That isn't theft. That's compassion." Applause broke from the benches, quick and sharp, until the judge rapped his gavel. "Order." The sound settled the room, but the current of emotion remained. Reed rose to his feet, slamming his palm against the table. "Compassion doesn't pay bills. Property is property. I won't be robbed by a fool farmer too sentimental to know when to quit." Shadow startled at the harsh tone, ears pinning back, body trembling. Daniel stepped closer, resting a calming hand against his neck. The horse pressed into him, seeking steadiness. The moment silenced the room more effectively than any gavel. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Bring the animal closer." Sheriff Markham guided Shadow to the center of the room. Reed extended his hand, voice firm, commanding. "Here, boy." His tone carried the bark of ownership, sharp enough to sting. Shadow shied back, hooves scraping against the floor. His eyes rolled white, breath rasping. Then Daniel stepped forward, his voice low, steady as the ground itself. "It's all right, Shadow. Come here." The horse turned, ears flicking, and moved toward Daniel without hesitation. He pressed his head against the farmer's chest, exhaling a shudder that echoed through the quiet hall. Daniel's hand steadied against his mane, his eyes closing briefly as he whispered, "Good boy." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Reed's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, papers forgotten. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, voice heavy. "This court will recess for deliberation." The gavel struck, but no one moved. The image lingered too strongly. A broken horse choosing not the man with papers, but the man who had given him a reason to live. And in that choice, the weight of law began to tremble. The courthouse smelled of damp wood and dust when the crowd filed back in after recess. Lanterns hissed softly, their flames shivering in the draft that slipped through cracks in the old windows. Outside, the square was packed with townsfolk who couldn't squeeze inside but refused to leave before the outcome was known. Farmers leaned on wagon rails. Children sat cross-legged on the steps, all waiting for the gavel to fall. Daniel stood by the table, hat in his hands, Shadow at his side. The horse shifted occasionally, ears flicking at the hum of voices. but his body pressed close against Daniel's as if anchored there. Across the room, Reed sat stiff and furious, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. The smugness had drained from his face, replaced by a tightening jaw that seemed carved from stone. Judge Whitaker re-entered, his robe heavy, his steps measured. He seated himself, cleared his throat, and let the silence stretch until it weighed like iron over the room. Finally, he spoke. This court has heard testimony from both sides. The law, as written, protects ownership established through contract and sale. That cannot be disputed, but law is not meant to exist apart from life. It is meant to protect it. The judge's eyes moved between Reed and Daniel, then lingered on Shadow. When Mr. Reed abandoned this horse, left him without food, shelter, or care, he relinquished more than responsibility. He relinquished his claim. Mr. Ward took that animal into his care, gave him food, shelter, and attention. The evidence shows not only survival, but trust built where fear once ruled. Reed's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, abandonment does not nullify." The gavel cracked hard against the wood. "Sit down," the judge commanded, his voice sharp. "I have heard enough." The gallery was so silent that the creak of the judge's chair echoed like thunder. He leaned forward, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years on the bench. "This court rules that the gelding known as Shadow is no longer property of Mr. Reed. Legal custody and ownership are hereby granted to Mr. Daniel Ward." For a heartbeat, the room stood frozen. Then applause erupted, filling every corner of the chamber. People rose to their feet, clapping, stamping, the sound rolling out the doors and into the square beyond. Children shouted, neighbors cheered, hats were thrown into the air. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, tears glinting in her eyes. Dr. Howard exhaled heavily, removing his spectacles as though the decision had been carved out of his own chest. Sheriff Markham allowed himself a faint smile before restoring order with a sharp bang of the gavel. Daniel didn't move. He stood still, staring at the judge, the roar of approval around him muffled by the thrum of his own heartbeat. Slowly, he turned his head toward Shadow. The horse nudged forward, pressing his muzzle into Daniel's shoulder, releasing a deep sigh that seemed to carry months of waiting. Daniel closed his eyes, laying a hand against the coarse mane. The noise of the courtroom faded into nothing. For him, the verdict had already been spoken long before the judge's words, spoken in the ditch where he had first stopped, in the water he had poured from his own canteen, in the steady gaze that had met his each night in the stable. Now the world finally caught up. Reed stormed from the courthouse, his boots striking the floor with sharp, angry cracks. His lawyer scurried after him, papers clutched tight. But the weight of his defeat lingered in the air, heavy and unmistakable. No law could erase what the people had seen with their own eyes. A horse that had chosen his rescuer over his abuser. When Daniel and Shadow stepped back into the square, the crowd surged around them. Hands reached out to pat Daniel's back, to touch Shadow's flank. Children pressed apples into his palms, wide-eyed and smiling. Women offered warm words, men tipped their hats. For years, Daniel had walked these streets with silence trailing behind him like smoke. Now every face turned. Toward him carried something different. Respect. Through it all, Daniel remained quiet. He wasn't a man who sought praise, and no verdict could erase the years he had carried alone. But as he led Shadow through the throng, he felt something lighter than pride. Belonging. By the time they reached the farm again, dusk had fallen. The lantern light in the stable flickered gently, waiting. Daniel led Shadow inside, removed the rope, and stood for a long moment, hand resting on the horse's neck. The words rose without force, simple and true. "You're free now," he whispered. Shadow lowered his head, eyes half closing, and leaned into him. The weight was heavy, but Daniel bore it gladly. For the first time in years, he felt not like a man enduring the land, but like one anchored to it again. The law had spoken, but more than that, so had life. Autumn slipped quietly into winter. The fields browned, the cottonwoods dropped their last brittle leaves, and the air carried the bite of frost each morning. Yet on Daniel's farm, there was warmth that hadn't lived there for years. Shadow had grown stronger. His frame was still marked by scars, his step still careful, but his coat had begun to gleam under Daniel's daily brushing. He followed willingly now, not with the halting fear of a creature waiting for the next blow, but with the calm assurance of trust earned. In the mornings, when Daniel opened the stable door, Shadow would greet him with a soft rumble in his throat, ears flicking forward at the sound of his name. Daniel rose with purpose each day, chores no longer done in silence but woven into the rhythm of care. He hauled feed, patched fences, delivered small loads into town with Shadow pulling a light cart. Children would wave when they passed, shouting, "There's Shadow!" Their voices bright with the wonder of a story that had traveled farther than the wind could carry. At first, Daniel had resisted the attention, lowering his gaze when neighbors stopped to talk, shrugging off thanks. But slowly, something shifted. Not pride, he wasn't built for that, but a quiet acceptance that maybe he and Shadow weren't living on the margins anymore. Maybe they belonged, in the simplest sense of the word. Sarah visited often now, sometimes with bread or stew, sometimes with nothing more than her presence. She would lean on the stable door while Daniel worked, her eyes soft, as she watched the two of them move in tandem. She never pressed him about the past, never filled the silence with questions. Instead, she shared it, as though she understood that silence could be a kind of language too. One evening, as the sun bled into hues of purple and gold, Daniel sat on the porch steps, boots planted firmly in the dust. Shadow grazed nearby, the fading light turning his scarred frame into something almost noble. Sarah sat beside Daniel, a shawl wrapped tight against the chill. "He looks different now," she said softly. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady on the horse. "So do I." They sat in quiet for a while, watching as Shadow lifted his head toward the horizon, ears twitching at sounds too distant for human hearing. Daniel followed his gaze, seeing not just the fields but the stretch of land that seemed, for the first time, to welcome him instead of weigh him down. Later that night, after Sarah had gone home and the lamp in her kitchen window had gone dark, Daniel returned to the stable. Shadow stood waiting, eyes glinting in the lantern glow. Daniel rested a hand against the horse's neck, fingers threading through the coarse mane. "You're not just a horse," he whispered, the words low but certain. "You're the reason I kept walking when I didn't think I could anymore." Shadow lowered his head, pressing gently against Daniel's chest, exhaling in a warm sigh that carried both weariness and peace. The farm was quiet. No storm rattled the boards, no angry voices threatened from the road, just the steady sound of breath, the scent of hay, the soft rustle of the night. Daniel leaned into that stillness, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence did not hurt. When dawn came, pale light spilled across the land, brushing frost into gold. Daniel stepped out of the farmhouse, his coat pulled tight, and saw Shadow waiting at the gate, ears pricked, ready for the day. Together they walked into the fields, their shadows stretching side by side across the frozen earth. Neither discarded, neither forgotten. Chosen by each other, and by the simple mercy of being seen. And as the horizon opened before them, quiet and endless, Daniel felt the truth settle deep in his bones. Life had given him back more than he thought possible. Not through miracles, not through law, but through the stubborn endurance of compassion. It was enough. More than enough. And so, Daniel and Shadow found not just survival, but a second chance at life. Their story reminds us that compassion can heal even the deepest wounds. If this touched your heart, let me know with a simple comment. Just type 0 or 1 below, and I'll know you were here until the very end. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story, because every broken soul deserves a chance to be seen.